The decree took 11 minutes. I timed it because timing things is a habit I can't shake, and because 11 minutes struck me as funny for a 9-year marriage. Then my wife caught me in the 3rd-floor hallway outside family court, took my right hand like she was going to shake it, and pressed a folded square of paper into my palm. 7 days, she said. Read it in the car. I can read in a hallway, Yesenia. I've got a graduate degree in reading in hallways. She didn't smile. She had this way of holding still that always made me talk more, and I'd spent 9 years filling her silences with material. I unfolded the paper right there in front of the water fountain. 8 words in her small square handwriting. The kind of handwriting that comes from a person who transcribes other people's talking for a living and has no use for flourishes. You have 7 days to prepare. Please. Why? I want you to understand what my life was at that moment, because it matters to everything that came after. I close claims for a living. Catastrophe adjuster, staff side, Sabinal casualty, 11 years. When a storm comes through the coast and takes the shingles off 4,000 houses, I'm the guy who shows up with a tablet and a warm handshake and gets people to sign. I'm good at it. Not good in the technical way I couldn't frame a wall to save my life. And I've been wrong about a trust more than once. I'm good at the part where a man is standing in his flooded kitchen at the worst hour of his year, furious. And 40 minutes later, he's telling me about his daughter's volleyball season and initialing a proof of loss for less than he should have taken. That's the skill. That's the whole skill. I can make almost anybody feel like the thing I want is the thing they wanted. So when my wife of 9 years handed me a doomsday note beside a courthouse water fountain, my instinct wasn't fear. It was performance. 7 days to prepare for what? I said. Bankruptcy, because congratulations, you've already handled that part. Desmond. Is it a diet thing? Are we doing a cleanse? You're going to do the joke, she said. I know you have to do the joke. Do the joke and then listen to 3 things. I did about 4 more jokes. She waited them out. The clerk's window down the hall clicked and hummed. Somebody's toddler was screaming in the stairwell in that flat, tireless way toddlers scream in county buildings. 3 things, she said finally. 1. Don't cross to the mainland after the 6th day. Not for work, not for me, not for your mother's birthday. 2. Whatever you buy it on the island, and buy it before Thursday. 3. She stopped. This was the one she'd been building toward, and I could tell because she'd gotten quieter instead of louder. If anybody comes to you and says I sent them, if they use my name to get onto Perdiz, you don't owe them anything. Not one thing. Do you hear me? Why would anyone use your name? Do you hear me? Yesenia. Why would anyone use your name to get onto a barrier island with 1 grocery store and a bait stand? She looked past my shoulder at the courtroom door, and then she looked at her watch, and then she said, I have a hearing at 2. And that was it. That was my divorce day. Here's the part I've told 100 times as a joke and can't tell as a joke anymore. 10 minutes later, in the parking garage, I saw her on level 2 loading a hand truck into the back of a white flatbed that wasn't hers. There was a man with her, mid-50s, sunburned in the specific pattern that comes from wearing a welding hood, and he took the hand truck from her and did that thing men do when they want a woman to stand back from the heavy end. And she let him. In 9 years, I had never once been allowed to take the heavy end from Yesenia Duarte. I sat in my car on level 3 and I did the math a divorcing man does. She had asked for the mainland condo and given me the island house, which everybody I knew called a gift because everybody I knew hated the island house. The salt The insurance, the Causeway closing every time the wind came up over 40. She had asked for a cash equalization of $71,400, which had come out of my retirement in a way I'd been sick about for 2 months. She had not asked for the boat trailer, the dog we didn't have, or one single thing that was actually mine in a sentimental sense. And now there was a sunburned man in a parking garage with a hand truck. You can see where I went. Every claim has a most likely cause of loss, and I've built a career on the most likely cause. The most likely cause was Wade. I didn't know his name yet, but I named him Wade in my head that afternoon, and I turned out to be right about the name and wrong about everything else, which about summarizes my performance that week. I drove back over the Cameron Causeway at 4 in the afternoon with the note in my shirt pocket. 2.1 miles of concrete over green water. Pelicans stacked up on the rail like they were charging admission. Perdiz Island is 9 miles long and about a half-mile wide at the wide part. 2,900 people in winter, more in July. One road on, one road off, and a swing bridge at the island end where the intracoastal cuts through, which the county opens for barge traffic and which everybody on the island hates with a personal, ancestral hatred. On the bay side, there are the Sablitas Flats, and I need you to hold on to the flats because they're the reason for most of what happened. At high tide, the flats are 2 miles of shallow water, and the island is an island. At low tide, the flats are mud and grass and knee-deep guts you can walk if you don't mind losing a shoe. Every fisherman on Perdiz knows this. Every kid who's ever waded out for crabs knows this. Nobody in county emergency management has ever once written it down in a way that mattered. I got home, and I put the note under a magnet on the refrigerator. And then I took it off the refrigerator because I didn't want to look at it. And I put it back in my shirt pocket, where it stayed for 5 days and got soft at the folds. Then I went to the sandbar, and I turned it into material. That's the thing I can't get around. I could have kept my mouth shut. I have a nice mouth shut when I want one. Instead, I stood at the rail of a bar with 14 people in it. And I read my ex-wife's warning out loud in a hushed television voice. And I got the laugh, and then I got the bigger laugh when I said, 7 days. She scheduled the apocalypse around my divorce, so she'd only have to see me once. Perla Sandoval was down at the end, with her ankles crossed. 74 years old, drinking club soda because she'd given up beer for Lent in 1998, and just kept going. She runs the Laundromat on Dock Street. She said, 7 days, mijo. Prepare for what? That's the beauty, unspecified. It's a blank check of dread. Yesenia doesn't joke, Perla said. No, I agreed. That was my job. Very clear division of labor. And Neil Trapani, who owns the fuel dock and the marine hardware and about a third of the debt on this island, said from behind his beer, "What did she take you for in the settlement?" 71.4. He whistled. Then she's got 71.4 worth of reasons to want you looking the other direction. I remember laughing at that, because it fit the story I'd already built. And I remember 2 nights later, when the joke had gone around the island the way a joke does in a town with one grocery store. And a woman I barely knew stopped me in the parking lot of that grocery store and asked me, seriously, without any humor at all, what exactly my wife had said. Her name was Cristela. She had a kid on her hip. She wanted to know if she should buy diapers ahead. I told her no. I told her Yesenia was under a lot of stress and that people say things during divorces. I was warm about it. I was very, very good at it. And she thanked me, and she went inside and bought 1 package of diapers. And later that week, I thought about that package a lot. The next 2 days, I worked. There was a hail event up in the county from March that still had 11 open files. And I sat in trucks and living rooms and did what I do. Monday afternoon, I closed a roof claim on a house off Palmetto Row for $8,000 under the estimate, because the homeowner's wife interrupted us to say her sister's dog had died, and I spent 20 minutes on the dog. And by the time we came back to the roof, the fight had gone out of them. That's not a confession. That's a Monday. Somewhere in there, the news started doing the thing where it doesn't say anything but says it more often. A state health order about a facility upriver at Devil's Elbow, 80 miles inland, some kind of processed water violation, and a company suing to block it. 2 hospitals in the interior on diversion for capacity, a jail transport rerouted, a high school in Belclaire that closed for a deep clean. If you put those 4 items on one page, they look like a page from any month of any year. I've read hundreds of pages like that. Nothing on them ever came to my door. Tuesday, I called Yesenia to fight about the money, and she didn't pick up. And Wednesday, I drove to the Mainland and went to her condo, which she had gotten and which I had paid a third of the down payment on, and which is a fact I mentioned within 11 seconds of her opening the door. She was in a t-shirt with drywall dust on it. Behind her, the living room was mostly empty. No sofa, no television. The dining table was there with a laptop on it and 4 cardboard flats of canned tomatoes stacked against the wall. And I looked at those tomatoes and, God help me, felt vindicated. Look at that. Crazy tomatoes. Case closed. You spent my retirement on tomatoes. Some of it. Yesenia. You want to come in and yell, or yell out there? I came in. I yelled a little. She let me, which is a technique. And I know it's a technique because it's mine. When I ran out, she went to the kitchen and came back with 2 glasses of water and sat down across the table and said, "Ask me things I can answer." That's a hell of an opener. It's the only one I've got. So I did what I do in a bad faith examination. You never ask the big question first. You ask around the edges until the shape shows up. Where's the money? Spent. On. Diesel, rice, beans, oil, salt, powdered milk. 400 pounds of dog food because it's cheap protein and I got it at cost. A used chest freezer. 900 feet of chain link. A welder's time. Wade. Her eyebrows went up about a millimeter. You met Wade? I saw Wade, in a parking garage, taking a hand truck out of your hands like a gentleman. And she laughed. Not a nice laugh, a short, surprised, tired one. Wade Guillory is 61 and has a wife named Odette, who calls me to ask about my knee? That's what you did with your week? That's what I did with my week. Okay, she said, and she wasn't laughing anymore. That's my fault. I gave you nothing, so you filled it in. You gave me 8 words. I gave you 7 days, she said, which was more than I had. Here's where I started to slip. Not because of anything she said, because of what was on the table. Her laptop was open to a spreadsheet, and I couldn't read the cells from where I sat. But I could read the shape of it, because I have looked at 10,000 spreadsheets. And this one was a scope. It was a line item scope of work, the kind I write when I'm pricing a repair. Materials, quantities, unit cost, extended cost. Somebody had built that scope carefully, over days, with a person who knew what things cost. That is the exact moment my story about a greedy woman and a sunburned man started coming apart. And it had nothing to do with love or trust. It was formatting. She had itemized. What's the diesel for? Pumps. What pumps? Ask me things I can answer. That was a thing you could answer 4 seconds ago. She put both hands flat on the table. I sat a hearing, she said. In chambers, closed, sealed by order, and I'm the officer of the court who made the record. which means if I tell you one sentence of what was said in that room, I lose my certification, I get contempt, and I probably get a criminal referral. And none of that helps you at all. So no, I'm not going to tell you what I heard. Then why write me a note? Because I could tell you a number, she said. A number isn't testimony. A deadline is on a docket. Anybody can read a docket. 7 days. 7 days from Friday. That's a compliance date. That's all I gave you, and it's all I'm giving you. And Desmond. And she stopped. And she got a look I hadn't seen on her in years, which was the look of somebody who is about to say something they've rehearsed and are still not sure of. I don't know what it means. I know what a room sounds like when the lawyers stop performing. I've made the record in that room for 11 years. I know what it sounds like when a state's attorney asks a question he doesn't want the answer to. That's not evidence. It's not anything. It's a feeling with a date on it. And you blew up our marriage over a feeling with a date on it? No, she said. I blew up our marriage because you would have talked me out of it. I laughed at her. I did. I sat in her half-empty living room and I laughed. And I said something like, "Come on, you've never done a single thing in your life because I told you to." And she said, "Karina." That took the air out of me, and it's going to take a minute to explain why, so bear with me. 4 years ago, we had a storm come up the coast that was going to hit 200 miles south of us and then didn't. Yesenia wanted to leave the island on the Wednesday. I ran the numbers, and I want to be careful how I say this, because the numbers weren't wrong, exactly. Track probability, historical landfall. The fact that the Causeway becomes a parking lot the minute the county says the word evacuate. The fact that a hotel inland would run us $600 for what would almost certainly be a long weekend of bad television. I built a case. I'm good at cases. Then I made it fun. I made staying feel like a plan we'd made together. A 2-day picnic with candles. And by Wednesday night, she was making a grocery list. Thursday, the storm turned. Not much. Enough. The water came up Dock Street and into our first floor at about 2 in the morning, and Yesenia went next door for Karina Escamilla, who was 80 and did not believe in leaving. And the two of them ended up in Karina's attic for 9 hours with the water 4 steps below the hatch. Yesenia is 5'2". There was a point in there, she told me once and never again, where she was standing on a cedar chest holding Karina's arms up, and her own chin was at the waterline. Karina lived another 2 years. Yesenia came out of that attic with a thing about water she has never gotten over. She can be on a boat. She can be in a boat all day. She cannot be in water above her chest. And she can't make herself. And it isn't a choice she has access to. I've watched her stand at the end of a dock in August and not go in. And the reason she said that name to me across that table was not to make me feel bad about a storm. It was one line of argument, delivered cleanly, the way she'd heard 1,000 lawyers deliver one clean line. You have a documented history of talking me out of leaving, and it cost me something I can't get back. So the divorce, I said, was the only argument you couldn't win, she said. I couldn't out-talk you. I've never once out-talked you. So I took the veto away. That's what a decree is. It's a piece of paper that says you don't get a say in what I do with my half. You could have just, could I? She said. Say the sentence. Say the whole sentence out loud. You could have just told me you were scared and asked me to spend $70,000 on rice. Say it, and then tell me what you'd have done. I sat there, and I ran the tape. Honestly, for maybe the first time that week. I know exactly what I'd have done. I'd have been so kind about it. I'd have made her feel heard. and I'd have brought up her mother's anxiety. And I'd have gotten a plan out of it that involved a case of water and a conversation in the spring. I'd have closed you, I said. You'd have closed me. Then she got up and went to the kitchen and came back with a receipt. And this part I need to be exact about, because it's the hinge of everything that happened afterward. It wasn't a document I found. She handed it to me and made me read the top line out loud like I was a slow child. Perdiz Ice House. Cold storage and dry storage lease. Unit 2 and the loft. Lessee Y. Duarte. Lessor I. Villaseñor. I said his name twice before I could get anything else out. You rented from Ismael Villaseñor. He had the only concrete building on that island with a slab above surge and a working 3-phase, she said. And he's the only man on Perdiz who'd have taken cash and not talked about it at the sandbar. Yesenia, do you know what I did to that man? I made the record on it, she said. Not the settlement. The hearing after, when he tried to reopen. I wasn't allowed to look at you for 2 days. Here it is then, the thing you'll want to know, and I'll put it as plainly as I can stand. In 2022, the ice house took a hurricane on the corner. Ismael Villaseñor's father built that building in 1961 out of concrete and stubbornness, and the storm peeled the north wall's roll-up door assembly, the big steel one, 22 feet off its frame, and bent the frame with it, and it cracked the header. And it did some things to the loft stair I never went up and looked at. Ismael carried a policy with us. I was the adjuster. I did not commit fraud. I want that on the record, since it's the only clean thing I've got. What I did was find an exclusion, which is my job, and then I built the exclusion into a story, which is my talent. The frame had pre-existing corrosion, which is true of every piece of steel that has ever been within a mile of the Gulf of Mexico. I brought a photograph. I brought a metallurgist's 1-page opinion that cost the company $400. And then I sat in Ismael's kitchen for 2 hours with his wife, who was sick then. And I talked about his father's hands and the price of shrimp and how long litigation takes, how very long. And I got him to accept $31,000 and sign a release on a repair that would have run about $200. He put on a plywood and strap patch and hung the old bent roll-up back in the crooked frame with a chain fall and a lot of prayer. And that was that. His wife died the next spring. He stopped speaking to me in a way that wasn't dramatic. He just looked slightly to the left of my head for 3 years. And my ex-wife had rented storage from him, in cash, and stacked 4,000 pounds of food inside a building whose only real weakness was a thing I had personally arranged to not be fixed. Who else knows what's in there? I asked. Ismael, Wade's wife, and me. That's 4. That's 4, she said. Yesenia, 4 is not a number. 4 is a broadcast. I know what 4 is, she said. I made a choice. I couldn't lift it alone. I left about 20 minutes later. On my way out, I said the meanest thing I said all week, which was that if she'd wanted to prepare for a disaster, she could have started with the one she was actually causing. And she said, "That's good. Use that one at the bar." And I drove back over the Causeway at sunset, with the flats going gold on the bay side and my whole framework of the week lying in pieces on the passenger seat. Now, Thursday night I did not buy supplies. I want you to sit with that, because I've had to. I had a full afternoon of unrebutted evidence, a scope of work, a lease, a woman who was not lying and had never once lied. And 8 words in my shirt pocket, and what I did with it was drive to the island, sit on my own steps, and construct a better story than the one I'd just been handed. The better story went like this. Yesenia sat a bad hearing about a chemical plant. Yesenia has a documented anxiety about water and disasters, medically documented prescription and all. Yesenia has spent 4 years in a low-grade panic she manages by organizing. This is the attic. The attic came back for her, and it dressed itself up as a compliance deadline, and she processed it by buying rice, and the honest, decent, loving thing I can do for a woman I still love is not feed it. Every single sentence in that paragraph was true. That's the part nobody warns you about. You can build a completely true story that is completely wrong. So Friday morning, the 5th day, instead of buying a hand pump and 400 rounds of nothing and a case of water, I got in my car and drove to the mainland to file a motion. That's what I did. Day 5. I drove to the courthouse in Port Andrade to file a motion to modify the decree, to claw back a portion of the equalization payment on the theory that my ex-wife was dissipating marital assets while in a documented state of psychological distress, and I had a 9:15 appointment with a lawyer named Bat, who charged me $400 to tell me I'd probably lose and to help me do it anyway. She'd said, "Don't cross to the mainland after the 6th day." Friday was 5. I had a buffer. I remember thinking about the buffer while I waited at the swing bridge, which was open for a barge. 4 cars ahead of me, radio on. The thing came on the 5th day. She was 2 days off. I've thought about that more than I've thought about almost anything else. And here's where I've landed. She gave me a real number from a real docket, and the number was about a lawsuit, not about a virus. And a virus doesn't read the docket. She was not a prophet. She was a woman who heard something in a room and guessed at the rest. And her guess was 2 days generous. And those 2 days are the difference between everything. At 10:40, I was standing at the clerk's window on the 1st floor of the Nueces del Sur County Courthouse, arguing about a filing fee. That's the honest picture. Cream tile, a security guard named Doyle, who I knew because I know everybody, a bad ficus in a bronze pot, and me being charming at a woman behind glass so she'd let me pay by card. Then the doors on the Rio Street side made a noise I'd never heard a courthouse door make. I've been asked to describe the first minutes about 50 times, and I always disappoint people. There was no siren. Nobody announced anything. There was a sound like a crowd at a high school game when something happens on the far side of the field. And then people came into the lobby. Too many at once. Wrong. A man in a suit with his lanyard on backward. A woman carrying one shoe. Doyle went toward it because he was a guard, and that's the direction guards go. And I remember thinking, in the crisp administrative way you think when you have no idea what's happening, that Doyle was going to have paperwork. Then a bailiff came around the corner from the security lane at a dead run and shouted the only sentence anybody gave us that whole morning. "Lock the lane, don't let them." And he never finished, because behind him came a person. I'm going to say person, and I'm going to keep saying person, because that's what they are, and I'm not interested in the other words people use. He was maybe 30. He had on the paper wristband they give you at the hospital in Port Andrade. He came through that lobby without stopping. And the not stopping was the whole horror of it. Then and afterward. When you watch a person move, some part of your brain is always predicting the little corrections, the slowing at the corner, the sidestep around the ficus. He didn't correct for anything. He went through the ficus. I have never been fast. I was fast once for about 6 minutes in that lobby. I went up the stairs, which was wrong and lucky. Wrong because up is a trap. Lucky because Yesenia was on 3. The 3rd floor hallway was where I'd stood on Monday with a piece of paper in my hand, and now it had 30 people in it, and a woman in a robe telling everyone to go to their courtrooms and lock the doors, which is the last competent instruction I heard from any official person for 6 days. Yesenia came out of the door of Judge Faraday's court with her steno machine still in her arms, which tells you everything about her. The woman evacuated a courthouse, holding 40 pounds of equipment, because that machine was the record, and the record was her job. She saw me. Her face did something complicated. "You crossed," she said. "It's the 5th day. You said the 6th. You crossed to sue me. Can we do this at a different altitude?" She put the machine down on a bench and left it there, which I think cost her something. And then she took my wrist, not my hand, my wrist, like a nurse, and said, "Stairwell C, the judge's stair. It comes out on the ramp by the sally port." How do you know that? Because I've walked out of this building 4,000 times, and you've walked out of it twice. That's the last argument I lost cleanly and gladly. The next hour, I'll compress, because the details are all the same detail. Port Andrade is a town of 40,000 with one hospital, and the hospital is 9 blocks from the courthouse, and whatever came into that hospital in the night came out into the streets in the morning. We came out of Stairwell C into a service ramp with 2 deputies at the top of it, who told us to go back inside, and we went around them. And after that, nobody told us anything for a very long time. The street noise wasn't screaming. It was car alarms and horns, mostly, and glass and the particular sound of 1,000 engines all trying to go the same direction, which is a sound like a lawnmower the size of a county. Yesenia's car was in the flat lot on Obregon, and it was boxed by a Suburban with its doors open and its wipers going. "Mine's on the roof of the garage," I said. "Then it's on the roof of the garage forever," she said. "Look." The garage exit ramp had 3 cars in it, nose to tail, one of them with its front wheels turned into the wall. Everybody with a car on a roof in Port Andrade that morning learned about ramps. So we walked 2 miles east toward the Causeway, through the part of town that is body shops and tire places and a Vietnamese bakery with a hand-lettered sign. And I have to tell you the truth about those 2 miles, which is that they were not frightening in the way the movies do it. They were frightening in the way a car wreck you're driving toward is frightening. Long, quiet stretches where nothing at all is wrong. A woman watering her yard who yelled at us that we should slow down. We were scaring her dog. Then a block with 4 abandoned cars and a smear of something on a windshield, and every door on the street standing open. Then 2 more normal blocks. Twice we saw people who weren't right, and both times they were far enough off that we changed streets. The second one was a heavy man in a delivery uniform who came down the middle of Alameda at that same relentless 3-mile-an-hour walk. And Yesenia stopped dead and said, "That's Emerito. He does our building." She said his name 3 or 4 times, quietly, the way you'd read from a page. Then she said, "He's slow." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "So it's not about being fast, it's about not stopping." And I want it noted that my ex-wife arrived at the operative principle of the next 2 weeks in about 11 seconds, while I was still trying to make my legs work. The Causeway approach was worse than the town. 4 lanes of stopped cars going out to the island, and the shoulder full of people walking, and a county truck sideways across the inbound lanes with nobody in it. And out at the end of it, 2 miles away, the swing bridge sat open. Somebody had opened the bridge. To this day, nobody's told me who, and I've stopped needing to know. Maybe a bridge tender following a barge schedule. Maybe a bridge tender who'd thought about it for 90 seconds and made the best decision anybody made that day. Either way, from the top of the Causeway rise, you could see the gap in the road with green water running through it. And every single person on that concrete understood at the same moment that they were standing on a 2-mile-long pier with a hospital at the shore end. That's when the crowd got dangerous, and that's when I earned my keep. There's a boat basin under the north side of the Causeway approach where the guides keep their skiffs. And there was a 19-year-old kid named Tobias Pham standing on the dock with the bow line of his uncle's flat bottom in his hand, and about 40 people coming down the ramp toward him. I know Tobias because I adjusted a claim on his uncle's shed. And I got down that ramp fast, and I did the only genuinely good thing I did that day, which was talk. Not to Tobias, to the crowd. I got between a skiff that holds 6 and 40 people who each individually deserve to live. And I ran the oldest close there is, which is to make the plan sound like it was already decided by somebody with authority. I said the boats would go in rotation, 4 at a time, and that the ones going first were the ones who could handle the return trip because we needed the boats to come back. I said it loud and bored, like a man reading from a clipboard he'd left in the truck. I picked people by looking at their hands. It worked for about 6 minutes and 11 passengers, and then it stopped working. And Tobias took us across in the second run and did not go back for a third. And I've never once blamed him for it. He was 19. His hands were shaking so hard he couldn't get the throttle cleanly. Yesenia sat in the bottom of that skiff with her arms locked over the gunwale and did not look at the water once. 200 yards of the intracoastal, maybe 90 seconds. Her knuckles were gray. When the bow hit the island side, she was out before it stopped, and she stood on the shell with her back to the channel and breathed like she'd run upstairs. "Okay," she said. "Okay," I said. "That's the last time I do that. That's the last time you have to." I meant it as a comfort. Everything I said that week that was meant as a comfort turned out to be a bill. Perdiz, when we walked up Dock Street at 1:30 that afternoon, had the specific atmosphere of a town that has heard something and hasn't decided to believe it. The grocery store was full. The sandbar was full. There was a line at Trapani's fuel dock, 4 trucks long, which is a line you only see before a named storm. Nobody was running. 2 men were arguing about whether the bridge being open was good or bad, which is the most Perdiz argument possible. And there were maybe 60 people standing in the street outside the ice house, because word had gotten around. And word had my name in it. Understand, I'd told a joke at a bar 6 days earlier. That joke had traveled. By that afternoon, it had grown a second act, which was that Desmond Ochoa's wife had warned him about this, and that Desmond Ochoa had a list. Ismael Villaseñor was standing in the small steel door of the north wall with his arms folded. Behind him, in the dark, I could see the shape of the roll-up still hanging in that bent frame, still with the plywood, and now with something new. Wade Guillory had welded a steel plate across the bottom 4 feet of it and set 2 3-inch dogs into the slab. Not a repair, a brace. Somebody had looked at the worst part of that building and braced it because they couldn't afford to fix it. Ismael looked at Yesenia. "You're here." "I'm here." "Not the plan." "No," she said. "It isn't." Then he looked at me, straight at me, for the first time in 3 years, and said, "You brought him." "He came on his own," she said. "He was suing me." Which is how 60 of my neighbors learned that detail, out loud, in the street, on the first afternoon. I'm going to slow down here, because the next 36 hours were where the whole thing was decided. And none of it was decided by anybody with a gun. Perdiz had, that Friday, 1 deputy on the island, Nadia Osei, 34, who had been on the day shift and whose partner was on the mainland side and never came back. It had a volunteer fire crew of 11, 4 of whom were on the mainland. It had a mayor who was in Corpus Christi at a conference. It had no functioning county radio traffic after about 4 p.m. Not because of anything dramatic, but because there was nobody left at the other end of it to answer. What it had instead was property. Trapani had the fuel and the hardware. Ismail had the only concrete building with a slab above surge and 4,000 pounds of food inside it. Perla Sandoval had a laundromat with a 100-gallon water heater, 2 floors, and a walk-up apartment. The school on the ridge had a kitchen, a generator hookup nobody had tested since 2019, and 4,100 square feet of gymnasium. So it wasn't a town anymore by Friday night. It was a negotiation with 8 parties. And I am, whatever else I am, a professional negotiator. And I went to work. And this is the part where I'd like to tell you I was a hero. The first thing that happened was Ismail tried to take the food. He didn't call it that. He came out into the street at about 4 and stood on the loading step and said calmly, in front of everyone, that the ice house was his family's building, that the storage in Unit 2 was leased and the lease was in default because the lessee had not paid the second month, and that under the terms he had a lien on the contents. "I paid you through November," Yesenia said. "You paid me for 2 units. You've got food in the loft. Loft's not on the lease. You told me to put it in the loft. I said you could. Saying you could isn't putting it on paper." And there it was, my whole professional life, coming back at me out of a shrimp man's mouth on the worst afternoon of the century. A technically defensible reading of a piece of paper deployed at the exact moment the other party has no leverage. He'd learned it from somebody. He'd learned it from me. The crowd, I should say, was on his side. Not because they'd read the lease, because he had the door, and they wanted to be on the side of the door. So I stepped up. Here's what I did, and I'll give it to you in the order I did it, because I've thought about the order a lot. First, I got him off the paper. I said, loud enough for the street, that a lien requires a demand and a cure period, and that nobody in the state of Texas had ever perfected a lien on a Friday afternoon. And I said it with the total confidence of a man who has never once looked up the actual statute. And I watched the crowd's attention slide off Ismail's certainty. That's all you need. You don't need to be right. You need the other guy to stop sounding right. Second, I made it about him personally, which is the move. I said, "Ismail, you want to be the man who took a widow's..." And he cut me off and said, "She's not a widow. She divorced you." And I said, "She's the woman who paid you cash when your slab needed a tenant, and everybody on this island knows why nobody else would rent from you. And that was cruel." And it landed, and the crowd made the noise crowds make. Third, and this is the one, I gave him something. Never take without giving. He didn't want the food. A 66-year-old man with a bad hip doesn't want 4,000 pounds of rice. He wanted to not be the man who got fooled twice by the claims adjuster in front of his neighbors. So I gave him the building. I said in front of everybody that the ice house was Villa Senior property, and that nobody went in or out except by his say, that the food inside was distributed by his hand, when he night, and that Yesenia and I were guests in his building on his terms. He took it in about 4 seconds. He had to. It was a better deal than the one he'd opened with, and I'd made it public, and public is a ratchet. And Yesenia watched me do it from 6 feet away with her arms crossed, and afterward, in the dark by the ice machine. She said the thing I've heard in my head every day since. "You just gave away the only thing I bought." I gave away custody, not the food. Desmond. She wasn't angry. It would have been easier if she'd been angry. I spent $71,000 and my marriage so that decisions about that food wouldn't have to go through a man. And in 20 minutes, you put it back through a man. He was going to lean it. He was going to bluster and then take a deal. He always takes a deal. I've watched him testify. She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands. You won the argument. You always win the argument. That's the whole problem, and you still don't hear it. The second thing that happened was the diesel. Trapani had about 900 gallons in his tanks, and a card reader that stopped authorizing at some point Friday afternoon when the network died, which meant he had 900 gallons and no way to sell them, which meant, in his mind, that he had 900 gallons and the moral authority of a man who'd bought them. The school needed fuel. Specifically, the school's Perdiz town water comes off the mainland through a line on the Causeway. And everybody on that island has always known that if the Causeway line goes, the only real water is the school's old irrigation well, and 2 artesian pipes out on the flat side that are half salt. The school had a generator that would run the well pump. The generator held 11 gallons. Yesenia's diesel, 420 gallons of it, bought in June, sitting in 2 poly tanks in a rented bay at the ice house, was on her spreadsheet for that exact purpose. That's what the pumps were. She'd figured out in the spring what the whole island figured out on Saturday. Trapani came to me Friday night because I was the one people came to, which was already a problem. He wanted the ice house loading bay for his hardware inventory, batteries, rope, tarps, propane, the whole store, because his building was frame construction 11 feet from the boat channel, and mine wasn't. Except it wasn't mine. It was Ismael's, which I had just publicly established. So I brokered. It took 2 hours, and it was, I'll say without pride, beautiful work. Trapani got the North Bay for his inventory and a guarantee of security. Ismael got a cut of the hardware, meaning he got to be the one who handed out tarps. And I got 400 gallons of Trapani's diesel promised to the school in exchange for Yesenia's 420 gallons going into Trapani's tanks for controlled distribution. Do you see it? I didn't for 11 hours. I traded a resource we possessed for a promise of a resource, and I did it because a promise from Neil Trapani felt like something I could enforce, because I had spent 11 years in a world where promises are enforceable. Saturday morning, Trapani's tanks were down to 600 gallons, because he'd spent the night selling fuel to boats, cash and gold and jewelry, and a man's outboard motor, and every single one of those boats left, and the fuel left with them. I went down to the dock and stood in front of him and did not have one thing to say. He said, "You made a deal for 400 gallons to the school. There's 600 in the tanks. You're covered." And then he said, "Unless the boats keep coming." That was Saturday, about 8 in the morning. By noon, the school had its 400 gallons in barrels on a trailer, which I want to be fair about the deal held. It held because I stood at the fuel dock for 4 hours and enforced it with nothing but my voice and the fact that people liked me. That was still worth something on Saturday. The rest of the diesel, the 200 spare gallons of margin that Yesenia had built into her spreadsheet in June, for the pumps that would come after the first pumps failed, was in a shrimp boat halfway to Freeport. The third thing that happened was Rudy. Saturday afternoon, a little after 2, a man came up Dock Street with 11 people behind him. They'd walked the causeway to the open bridge and come across in an aluminum John boat 2 at a time, and they were wrecked, sunburned. One man with his arm in a shirt sling, a girl of maybe 7 who wouldn't put her feet down on the shell because she'd lost her shoes. The man's name was Rudy Escamilla. He was Karina's grandnephew, which I found out later, and which means my ex-wife had once stood on a cedar chest and held his great-aunt's arms above the water for 9 hours. He didn't know that. He had no idea who Yesenia was, except in one specific way. He came up the street and he said to the crowd at large, "Which one of you is Duarte? We're on the list." And I felt the whole island turn and look at me, Yesenia was in the loft. She came down. And here's what actually happened, which is smaller and worse than what people on Perdiz still say happened. There was no list. There was never a list. In June, Yesenia had hired Wade Guillory to weld a brace and cut a door, and she'd paid him more than the job was worth, and at some point in there, sitting in a hot building with a man she'd come to trust, she had said out loud the only sentence she permitted herself all summer. If something happens, bring Odette out to the island. Wade told his wife. Odette told her sister. Her sister told the man who cuts her yard. And by Saturday, 80 miles of frightened people had turned one kindness into an institution with a list and a spot on it. There's no list, Yesenia said. She said it about 9 times over the next 20 minutes in different ways. And every time she said it, she lost more of the crowd. Because a woman saying, "There's no list," sounds exactly like a woman who has a list and is keeping you off it. Ismail was watching from the door. Trapani was watching from the corner. Osei was watching with her hand, not on her weapon, but near it. And she was, I could see even then, in bad shape. Her eyes were doing something. If anybody comes to you and says I sent them, you don't owe them anything, not one thing. That was the 3rd instruction. 6 days old, in my shirt pocket, soft at the folds. And in the moment I understood what she'd been afraid of. And in the same moment, I did the opposite of what she asked. Because I couldn't stand there and let a 7-year-old with no shoes be a policy question. So I closed them. That's the word we use. I've used it my whole career, and I've never once heard how it sounds. I got in front of Rudy Escamilla, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and I told him the truth in the sequence that made it survivable. Ice House was full. Ice House was Villa Seniors, and it was full true. The school was better for kids anyway. Kitchen, bathrooms, a nurse's office, 4,100 square feet. True. There was water coming online at the school today. Barrels of diesel already up there on a trailer. True. And then I said the sentence. Get your people up the ridge and get settled. And I will personally bring a run-up from here tonight. Rice, oil, milk powder. I'll walk it up myself. He looked at me for a while. He was not a stupid man. He said, tonight. Tonight. And he took 11 people up the ridge on my voice, and behind me Yesenia said nothing at all, which was worse than anything she could have said, because we both knew what a promise from me was worth in a building I just handed to a man who hated me. I did make a run that night. I want that in. Ismail allowed 40 pounds of rice, 8 of beans, 2 gallons of oil, and a case of the tomatoes. And I walked it up the ridge in 2 trips with Tobias Pham. And Rudy shook my hand. And that was the first run and the last one. Because by Sunday afternoon, the flats went out and the island stopped being an island. Here's what I mean, and I'll only explain it once. The tide on that coast is small, 1.5 feet, sometimes 2. And it doesn't come and go like the ocean. It's wind-driven as much as moon-driven. And a hard north wind can take the water off the Sablitas flats for a day and a half. Saturday night, the wind went north. Sunday, about 11 in the morning, a shrimper named Delfino, who had spent 50 years reading that water, came up Dock Street without hurrying and said, "Water's off the flats." Nobody understood. He had to say it 3 times, and then he had to draw it in the shell with his boot heel. Mainland, marsh, 2 miles of grass and mud with knee-deep guts through it. Island. Walkable. He'd walked it himself in 1994 on a bet. And it turned out that the thing about people who don't stop is that a knee-deep gut doesn't stop them either. They didn't come as a wave. I know that's what everybody expects, and I know why. And I'd rather tell you the true version, which was worse. They came the way weather comes. Sunday afternoon, there were 2 of them out on the flats, a half-mile off, moving in the general direction of the island, the way a person walks toward a sound they can't place. By dark, there were maybe 9. Monday morning, there were more than anybody could count from the water tower, spread over 2 miles of grass, some of them stuck to the waist in mud and still going. And the ones who got through came up onto the Bayside Shell Road at the north end, near the trailer park. They came at 3 miles an hour. They came for 30 hours without stopping. And I've heard people say since that it should have been easy, that a slow thing is a manageable thing. And to those people I want to say, 60 of them at 3 miles an hour, forever, against 9 of us who have to sleep. Sunday night, we lost the trailer park and the north half of Dock Street. And I don't mean in a battle, I mean people left. They ran to boats, to the school, to the ice house, and the buildings emptied out, and the doors stood open. Monday, the Causeway line went dry, which had nothing to do with anybody on the island, some pump station on the mainland with nobody left to babysit it. And by Monday afternoon, the only water on Perdiz was the school's well, the salt-tinged artesian pipes, Perla Sandoval's 100-gallon heater, and whatever anybody had in a jug. Monday afternoon is also when Nadia Osei's brother came out of the back of her patrol truck. She'd had him in there since Saturday. She'd brought him over from the mainland on the Friday, and he'd had a bite on his forearm under a wrapped towel. And she had looked at 11 volunteer firefighters and 1 shrimper, and lied to all of us with a completely steady face. I'd stood 4 feet from that truck twice. I'd asked her if she was all right, and she'd said she hadn't slept. I'm not going to describe what happened in the parking lot of the ice house. 2 people were hurt, one of them badly. And Nadia went into the building afterward and sat on the floor by the ice machine with her hands open on her knees. And when Ismail told her she had to go, she said, "Where?" You want to know if I judged her? I didn't. I've spent my whole career watching people hide the thing that will sink their claim, and every single one of them thinks they're going to get away with it because they love somebody. She hid her brother in a truck for 2 days because the alternative was to be the person who did something else with him. That's not a monster. That's a Tuesday in my line of work. But it cost us the deputy, and it cost us the parking lot, and it cost us, most of all, the last piece of trust anybody had in anybody, which had already been running on fumes since the business about the list. Tuesday morning, the ice house had 31 people in it, and I need to describe what a concrete building in September on the Gulf Coast with no air handling and 31 people is actually like. Because it's not in any story you've read. It's not spooky. It's hot. It's mildew and diesel and the Swedish ammonia ghost of a refrigeration system that hasn't run since Saturday. It's a 5-gallon bucket in the old brine room with a garbage bag in it, and a schedule for the bucket, and a fight about the schedule. It's a woman named Perla Sandoval, 74 years old, who walked down from her laundromat with a suitcase of clean towels because she'd figured out before any of us that clean cloth was going to matter more than almost anything. And who then organized 4 teenagers into a laundry rotation using buckets and a mop wringer, and made them believe it was a promotion. And it's the North Wall. By Tuesday there were, we thought, 40 or 50 of them on the island. They came down Dock Street in 1s and 2s at 3 miles an hour. And they did not go around the ice house, because 31 people make noise and heat and movement, and there's no version of the world where they don't. The steel door on the north wall held fine. Wade's brace held fine. It was the roll-up, the 22-foot roll-up in the frame that got bent in 2022 and never got replaced, that hung crooked with a plywood and strap patch and a chain fall and a lot of prayer. They didn't attack it. That's the thing. Nothing in that building was ever attacked. 15 or 20 people simply stood against the north wall for 30 hours because that's the direction they'd been going. And they leaned, and they shifted, and the door moved a half-inch in the frame, and then an inch. And every hour, the gap at the bottom got a little wider. And around midnight, on Tuesday, the plywood patch popped one of its straps with a bang like a shot, and the whole crooked assembly started to walk out of the header. Ismael Villaseñor was the first one to it, with a floor jack and a 4x4. I was second. There were 6 of us in the end, in the dark, holding a bent steel door in a broken frame with a floor jack, 2 4x4s, and the last of the chain fall. And Ismael on the low end, where the gap was, with his shoulder in it, 66 years old, hip and all. And I said it to him then, because there wasn't a later. This is my fault. I know whose fault it is. Ismael, I looked at this frame in 2022 and I knew. I said I know. He got the jack under and cranked it a quarter turn, and the door came back a half-inch, and something in the header made a sound like a knuckle. You want to do this now? No. Then hold the 4x4, Desmond. Those were about the last words. He held that end for 2 more hours while Wade Guillory welded plate to angle iron 11 feet away with a battery machine and a hood, and at some point in the 3rd hour, the header let go on the east side, and the top corner of the roll-up came in about 18 inches, and Ismael was on the low end where the gap was, and the 6 of us got everybody back except him. We got the door braced 20 minutes later, and it held for another 4 days. I'm not going to make his death into a lesson. He'd have hated that. And also, he wasn't a saint. He tried to lean a widow's rice on a Friday afternoon. And he cheated at dominoes. And he sold ice to charter captains at a robbery price for 30 years. He was a man who held the low end of the door because it was his father's building. But I'll tell you the thing that has actually stayed with me, which is smaller. 3 years ago, I sat in that man's kitchen, and I found a corrosion exclusion in a policy. And I turned it into a story about how long litigation takes, and I saved my employer about $170,000. And I got a note in my file about it. That's it. That's the whole transaction. It took 2 hours in a kitchen, and I've had 400 mornings since where I didn't think about it once. Nobody tells you that the paperwork has a physical location. That the sentence you wrote in a report in October 2022 is standing in a specific building on a specific street. And that one night it will get tired, and a man will be under it. Wednesday, we buried him at the end of the Shell Road. And Wednesday night, the ice house began to come apart as a place. Not because of the door, but because of Perla's arithmetic. She came to me with a plastic cup of the school's well water and said, "Taste that. Salt. That's Tuesday's. Today's is worse." She sat down on a pallet with her knees together, like a woman waiting for a bus. "They're pulling that well too hard, mijo. 40 people and no rain. It'll go to salt inside a week. And then nobody on this island has water except the north tank and what's in my heater. There's the artesian. That's the same water," she said, and she was right. I didn't know that, and she did, because her husband had drilled for the county in 1979. I'd like to say we made a plan. What actually happened was that Wednesday night, I sat against the concrete wall in the dark with my ex-wife, and we had the first real conversation we'd had in 9 years. Which I only know because I could hear how different it sounded. "I keep doing the math on the school," I said. "How many up there?" 41. Rudy's 11 and 30 of ours. "And they've got the well and no food." "They've got what I walked up on Saturday, 6 days ago." I put my head back against the block. I promised him a run every night. I know, I stood in the street and looked a man in the face. Desmond. She turned her head. In the dark, in that building, she was mostly a voice. And her voice was the flat, precise, unhurried voice of a woman who has spent 11 years writing down exactly what people said. Do you want to talk about the 41 people? Or do you want to talk about how it feels to be you right now? Because those are two different conversations, and I'll have either one, but not both at once. That's a hell of a thing to say to me tonight. It's Wednesday, she said. I've got a limited amount of Wednesday. So I asked her something I hadn't asked all week. What did you hear in the hearing? And she told me. Not because the seal stopped mattering, she was very clear that it still mattered. That the whole reason she built her life on that machine was that the record is the record. She told me because there was no longer any court to be in contempt of. And because I think she'd been carrying it in her chest for 4 months, and it had gotten heavy. It was almost nothing. That's what wrecked me. It was a Tuesday afternoon injunction hearing about a facility upriver, and a state health order, and a compliance date 7 days out from that Friday, and a lawyer for the company arguing about the scope of a testing protocol. And at one point, a state's attorney had asked a question about whether the facility's outflow monitoring had been continuous since June, and the company's expert had taken 11 seconds to answer. 11 seconds, she said. I counted because I had to note the pause, and then he said I'd have to check, and the state's attorney didn't follow up. He just sat down, and I've made the record on 4,000 hearings, Desmond. And I have never once seen a man not follow up on a question like that. That's what you had. That's what I had. A pause and a date. You blew up a marriage over a pause. I bought 4,000 pounds of food over a pause, she said. The marriage was because you'd have talked me out of the food. Then she said, and I was wrong about the date. It came Friday. I told you Sunday. If you'd waited until my 6th day to go to the mainland, you'd have been sitting on this island already, and I'd have been in that courthouse hallway by myself. I hadn't thought about it in that direction one single time. I sat there in the dark and did the flip, and it went through me like cold water. Then me suing you saved your life. Don't, she said. No, I like this. This is going in the toast at the... Desmond. I'm sorry. You're not sorry. You're doing the joke. A long breath. Do the joke. It's fine. It's how you stand up. Thursday the door held. Friday the door held. Saturday the wind came around to the south and the water came back over the flats. And the ones who were already on the island stayed on the island. But nothing new came across. And for 2 days it was almost possible to think in a straight line, which is when the ice house stopped being the plan. And I want to be careful and honest about how that happened, because it wasn't dramatic, and it's the truest part of this whole account. 30 people in a concrete building with no working ventilation in September, with a bucket in the brine room and 4,000 pounds of rice and no water. That's the sentence. Rice needs water. Everything we had needed water: the rice, the beans, the milk powder, the dog food. Yesenia had built a spreadsheet in June around a well and 420 gallons of diesel and 2 pumps. And by the second Saturday, the well was going salt. And the diesel was in Freeport, and 1 pump was still in its box because the fittings were wrong, and Wade Guillory was on the mainland side and had never come across at all. We had that Saturday in the ice house, about 90 gallons of drinkable water for 30 people and enough food to last us into the following spring. That's the joke the whole week was building to, and nobody laughed. So we moved. On the Sunday, in the middle of the day, when the water was high on the flats and the island had gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet when there weren't many of them left moving, 22 of us walked 1,100 yards up Dock Street to Sandoval's Wash and Dry, which had a 100-gallon heater full of clean water, a second floor, a flat roof with parapet, and a cistern under the concrete pad in the back that Perla's husband had put in 1981, for reasons that had made sense to him and to nobody else. It had 4,000 gallons of rainwater in it. She had never mentioned it, and when I asked her why, she said, "You didn't ask about water. You asked about food. Everybody asked about food. We carried what we could carry, 6 trips, with Tobias Pham and 2 of the firefighters watching the street ends, and we left about 3,000 pounds of rice in a concrete building with a broken door. And that's where it is right now, as far as I know." And the last piece, the one I'm still inside of. On the second Tuesday, at about 4 in the afternoon, Rudy Escamilla walked down the ridge to the laundromat with a young man and stood in the street below the second-floor window and called up. Not angry. That's what got me. If he'd been angry, I'd have had something to work with. He said the school was out of food. He said they'd had 9 days on 40 pounds of rice and a case of tomatoes, and whatever was in the cafeteria's dry storage, which was flour and shortening and about 600 packets of ketchup. He said they had water, plenty of water, salty but drinkable, and 41 people, 14 of whom were kids. And then he said, "You told me you'd walk it up yourself. Tonight, you said." I told them all you said tonight. And I stood at that window and looked down at a man I had closed in the street 11 days earlier. And I understood, finally, at 41 years old, in a laundromat, what my job had actually been for 11 years. It was never getting people to agree. Anybody can get people to agree. It was getting people to agree faster than the truth could catch up. We're in the office over the laundromat right now. It's not much of an office. Perla did her books up here, and there's a metal desk and a window unit that doesn't run, and a view down Dock Street to the water. It's about 11 at night. Yesenia's sitting on the desk with her back against the window frame and her shoes off. And the winds come around north again, which means by tomorrow afternoon the flats will be walkable, and the whole thing starts over. Here's the argument we've been having for 2 hours. There are 900 pounds of food in this building and 4,000 gallons of water under the back pad. There are 18 of us. There are 41 of them up the ridge with water and nothing to eat, and 1,100 yards of Dock Street between us, and the water goes off the flats sometime around 3 tomorrow afternoon. I want to go tonight. 2 carts, 4 men, the long way around past the church. And I want to go tonight because I said tonight 11 days ago to a man's face. Yesenia says the carts don't matter, that 4 men and 2 carts is 1 trip, and 41 people need a trip every day, and that what I actually want is to hand Rudy Escamilla a sack of rice and be forgiven for the sentence I said in the street. She's not wrong. I've been sitting here trying to find the part where she's wrong. "So what's your version?" I said. "My version is we bring them here. 41 people. There's water for 18 for maybe 4 months. There's water for 59 for 6 weeks, she said. And then it rains, because it always rains here in October. And I'd rather be 60 people with a roof and a cistern than 18 people who are very carefully correct. And if it doesn't rain? Then I was wrong about a date again, she said. I've been wrong about a date before. You survived it. I've got about 4 counter-arguments lined up. They're good ones. I can feel them sitting in my mouth the way they always do, all sorted, ready, and I know exactly which one to open with and exactly how long to let her talk before I use the second one. And I know this is the part I keep not being able to get past. I know that if I start, I will win. I have never not won. I won a hurricane. I won a corrosion exclusion in a dead man's kitchen. I won a lease dispute in a street full of frightened people, and gave away the only thing my wife ever bought me. She's waiting. She's got her head tipped back against the window frame and she's letting the silence sit there. The way she's let my silences sit for 9 years. And downstairs, somebody's moving a bucket. And outside on the flats, the water is already going out. "Say something," she says. "I'm thinking." "You're not thinking. You're loading." "Yesenia. I can hear you loading. I've been able to hear it since 2016. She sits forward and puts her hands on her knees. "So here's what I want. I don't want you to agree with me. I want you to lose one. On purpose. Right now, while it still costs something." And I've got the answer to that too. That's the awful part. I've got a warm, generous, completely sincere answer to that. And it takes about 90 seconds. And at the end of it, she'd be nodding. The wind's picking up. Somebody downstairs is asking whether they should wake Tobias for the roof watch. The tide's got about 16 hours, and I'm sitting in a laundromat office at 11 at night with my ex-wife, and she's looking at me, and I haven't said anything yet. I haven't said anything.